In ancient Rome, the act of escape was not merely rebellion, it was a direct insult to the Roman order itself. To run away from one's master wasn't just defiance. It was a challenge to the very structure that kept the empire standing. You can almost feel the tension of that time, can't you? By the way, where are you watching from right now? Imagine how different life must have been under that iron rule. For enslaved women who dared such defiance, punishment was designed to wound deeper than the flesh. It aimed to scar the soul. The first punishment many faced was branding, the searing mark of the fugitiva, the runaway. What time is it where you are right now? Picture this. A heated iron, glowing in the dim light, pressed mercilessly against bare skin. It wasn't just a mark, it was a ritual of domination, a ceremony of control. The iron's hiss against flesh spoke louder than any words. A single burn transformed a woman's life forever. The mark was often carved into her forehead, the most visible, most inescapable part of her body. Concealment was impossible. From that moment on, the iron had spoken for her, and Rome never let her forget it. These brands usually bore the letters FEG, short for fugitivus, or sometimes an even crueler inscription, Teniot fugitive. I hold you, fugitive. The message was clear. She belonged to someone, and even freedom could not erase that claim. Once branded, the woman became both warning and weapon, a living advertisement of Roman dominance. The act itself was often performed publicly, with jeering onlookers watching as the iron hissed and flesh burned. The pain, sharp and searing, was only the beginning. What followed was a deeper, lifelong punishment, psychological humiliation, social exile, and the destruction of dignity. In a world where a woman's modesty and appearance defined her worth, a burn across the face was a sentence worse than death. Even if she survived, she could never again blend into the crowd of Roman citizens. No disguise could hide the truth. That brand spoke louder than any voice, a mark not of identity, but of eternal disgrace. Some were restrained during the process, forced down as the metal scorched their skin. Others fainted from pain, only to awaken to a lifetime of shame. It's important to understand, this was not an exceptional punishment. It was routine, lawful, expected. Roman law made no distinction of gender when it came to cruelty, yet enslaved women bore a weight all their own. They were punished not just for their defiance, but for daring to possess a will of their own, for thinking they could decide the fate of their own bodies. Their punishment was not only meant to destroy, but to silence. Chained at the gate, the architecture of humiliation. In the world of Roman slavery, punishment was spectacle. It was meant to teach, to warn, to keep fear alive. And one of the most visible, degrading penalties inflicted upon runaway women was a punishment known as ad annuum, to be chained at the gate. This punishment carried immense symbolic weight. The entrance of a Roman domus, the family home, wasn't just a doorway. It was a threshold between the private and public worlds, between the master's authority and society's gaze. To be chained there meant to become part of that architecture, not as a person but as a warning. Imagine the scene. A woman, shackled by iron chains to a column or wall beside the grand doorway, her body exposed to the harsh sun or the cold rain. Every passerby could see her. Every neighbor could look upon her disgrace. She became a living signpost, a breathing symbol of discipline, chained between freedom and servitude. This punishment wasn't simply about restraint. It was about display. The Romans understood humiliation as power. They believed that breaking a person's spirit in public made obedience contagious. And for women, the degradation was doubled because in Roman culture, to be seen like this was to lose one's honor completely. To be exposed in public, half-dressed, beaten and chained, was to be stripped of all humanity. Her body became a message, her suffering a form of communication. This is what happens when defiance dares to breathe. Often, these women were denied even the simplest needs: food, water, shelter. left for days or weeks as living warnings at the threshold of the home they once served. Each hour was a performance of dominance. Each glance from a passerby, a reminder that her pain was meant to maintain the order of Rome itself. For enslaved women in ancient Rome, escape was not just a risk. It was a rebellion against the empire's soul. And the empire responded with cruelty designed to outlive its victims. The brand, the chain, the gaze, these were tools of memory. Rome wanted its people to remember who ruled and what defiance cost. The skin could heal, the bones could mend, but the mark of humiliation, that was eternal. Roman comedy and satire, especially the works of Plautus, often painted disturbing realities in jest. In these plays, slaves were mocked, deprived of food, or chained near the entrance of homes, forced to endure both hunger and humiliation for days on end. Though these scenes were framed as humor, they carried the bitter taste of truth. Archaeological excavations later unearthed fragments of this grim reality, iron shackles and rusted restraints buried within domestic ruins, silent witnesses to what laughter once concealed. This form of punishment was no isolated cruelty. It was a thread woven deeply into the daily fabric of Roman society. In an empire obsessed with hierarchy and appearances, humiliation itself became a tool of order. To be chained at the threshold of a household, a living reminder of subservience, was to be stripped not just of liberty but of humanity. It was a punishment of visibility, designed to crush the soul through exposure. The victim's suffering became a warning for all who passed, a wordless decree forged in iron. Step out of line, and this will be your fate. The message was psychological as much as physical. Rome understood the power of shame, and so punishment became theater, a spectacle of control performed on the stage of everyday life. Used as entertainment, women thrown into the arena. Among the most harrowing fates that could befall enslaved women in ancient Rome was to be thrown into the arena, forced to die not as warriors, but as entertainment. When we think of the Colosseum, the image that often comes to mind is that of armored gladiators locked in combat. But behind that spectacle was a far darker truth. Rome's arenas were not only stages for valor, they were theaters of punishment, crafted to display the empire's absolute authority over life and death. Women who dared to flee, who resisted servitude or defied their masters, often paid the ultimate price. Condemned under the sentence known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, they were delivered to death in front of thousands. This sentence, usually reserved for serious crimes like rebellion, desertion, or repeated escape, was carried out with one purpose: to destroy both the body and the will to resist. For the enslaved, there was no legal protection, no human rights to appeal to. Escape was not seen as a desperate bid for freedom. It was an act of defiance against the order of Rome itself. And so, women who tried and failed to flee could be paraded into the arena as disposable bodies, sacrificed to the empire's appetite for blood. The spectacle was drawn out for maximum effect. Some victims were stripped and chained, left defenseless before lions, leopards, or bears. Others were burned alive, or forced to reenact ancient myths in cruel, theatrical executions that blurred the line between punishment and performance. There were even cases where captured women were made to fight one another with crude weapons. Mock gladiators doomed to die for the amusement of a roaring crowd. Unlike trained fighters, these women were not meant to survive. Their deaths were not contests, they were conclusions. For Rome, this was control disguised as entertainment. The cruelty was amplified by humiliation. The arena stripped away whatever fragments of dignity remained. To the Roman audience, desensitized by years of violence and eager for spectacle, these moments were not tragedies but diversions. The suffering of those at the bottom of society became the laughter, the excitement, and the moral reinforcement of those at the top. Writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio occasionally mentioned women in the arena, though they often focused on noble-born women who chose the sword. Yet the records of enslaved women, those who did not choose but were condemned, are found in legal tablets and inscriptions that testify to their existence and their silence. For the Romans, these executions were not justice, they were warnings. Each bloodied body reminded the audience that the enslaved person was property, a living extension of their master's will. Freedom was an illusion and rebellion a death sentence. The applause of the crowd sealed the fate of those who tried to break their chains. Whipped without mercy, the Roman scourge. In the Roman world, the whip was far more than a weapon, it was an emblem of domination. It symbolized absolute control over another human being. For enslaved women who dared to escape or even question their subservience, the scourge was one of the most dreaded punishments imaginable. Each lash carried a message. Pain is the price of disobedience. The act was designed not merely to wound flesh, but to fracture spirit. The whip, often a flagrum equipped with multiple leather thongs weighted with fragments of bone or metal, tore into the skin with such ferocity that scars became permanent marks of ownership. Roman law granted enslavers unrestricted authority. There were no limits, no judges, no intervention. A master could decide punishment as they pleased, and flight was among the most unforgivable acts. In a world where honor and hierarchy defined existence, a runaway slave represented humiliation, a challenge to power itself. Thus, the retaliation was often swift, brutal, and public. Sometimes the whipping took place within the walls of the home, in front of other servants forced to watch. But in more severe cases, it unfolded in markets or open courtyards where the air filled with screams and the whip's echo, turning discipline into a public warning. There were no rules about how many lashes could be given. The cruelty was limitless. For enslaved women, punishment carried an added layer of degradation. It was not only about the body but the identity. Their clothes might be torn, their wounds exposed, their pain deliberately displayed to crush whatever pride or defiance remained. Each act of violence was meant to erase individuality, to reduce a person to property in the eyes of all who witnessed it. After the ordeal, a punished woman might be left trembling and broken, her body bloodied and clothes in tatters, displayed as a living lesson to others. In some cases, she was placed near the gate or marketplace so everyone could see what defiance looked like. Her silence spoke louder than any decree. Through every lash, every chain, and every public humiliation, Rome broadcast one message to its enslaved population. You belong to us. The empire's cruelty was not random. It was deliberate, methodical, and deeply psychological. It was a system built to destroy rebellion before it began, to break not just the body, but the will to be free. In the Roman world, the whip was not merely tolerated, it was expected. Beating and scourging were seen as ordinary instruments of correction, woven into the very logic of maintaining control. When an enslaved woman dared to run, her crime wasn't viewed as a desperate bid for freedom, but as a disruption to the sacred order of the domus, the household, the miniature empire of her master. Her punishment had to restore what Rome valued most: absolute authority. Roman literature and satire of the time reveal just how normalized such cruelty had become. Poets and playwrights like Horace, Juvenal, and Petronius casually described the cracking of whips, the cries of the punished, and the laughter of onlookers, not as tragedies but as social routine. The casualness of their words exposes the deeper horror. That brutality was not the exception, but the expectation. In their verses and scenes, beatings are woven into everyday life, almost mundane in tone, a reflection of a society that had long stopped questioning pain as a tool of order. Though these works were embellished for humor or moral satire, they mirrored a brutal reality. Cruelty was not only accepted, it was institutionalized. Whipping, in many cases, was only the beginning. It often served as the opening act to even harsher punishments, branding, chaining, or crushing labor that followed. The whip, however, remained the enslaver's preferred symbol of instant authority, swift, unquestioned, and absolute. It demanded submission not through justice, but through fear. Sent to the mines, a living death sentence. Among the punishments that haunted the enslaved in the Roman Empire, few inspired more dread than being condemned to the mines. For women who dared to flee servitude, deportation to the mines was not just a sentence. It was a slow, deliberate execution carried out through exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Though men were more frequently sent to quarries and mining camps, enslaved women were by no means spared. If their defiance was repeated or viewed as insolent, their fate was sealed under the grim decree known as damnatio in metallum, condemnation to the mines. This punishment was enshrined in Roman law, reserved for those who had committed the gravest acts of disobedience: theft, desertion, rebellion, or, for a slave, the simple audacity to run. The mines of the Roman provinces, from the mercury pits of Spain and the lead mines of Dacia to the barren depths of Sardinia and Noricum, were more than workplaces. They were tombs carved from rock. The air was thick with choking dust, the tunnels suffocatingly narrow, and the light almost non-existent. Collapse was constant, death inevitable. Enslaved laborers worked with primitive tools for endless hours, their hands bloodied and lungs filled with poison. And for the women sent there, the suffering was doubled. They were forced to endure the same brutal labor as men, hauling or breaking stone, clearing debris, all while facing the added terror of exploitation from guards and overseers. Abuse was rampant, protection non-existent. There were no witnesses, no laws, and no return. To be condemned to the mines was, in essence, to vanish. Few lived long enough to be released. Starvation, infection, exhaustion, or injury ended most lives within months. Some were chained together, unable to rest or even stand upright for long periods. Those who faltered were beaten where they fell. Even pregnancy offered no reprieve. Women carried children in darkness, giving birth on cold stone floors, only for their infants to die shortly after from neglect or exposure. In the eyes of Rome, they were no longer people. They were expendable resources, extinguished far from the city's gaze. Unlike the public punishments that flaunted agony as spectacle, the Roman mines delivered a quieter, far more chilling form of justice, punishment through disappearance. There were no cheering crowds, no roaring arenas, only darkness, stone, and silence. A woman condemned to the mines was not just punished. She was erased. Her suffering became invisible, her memory buried as deeply as her body beneath the earth. Rome's treatment of fugitive enslaved women, through chaining, branding, the lash, the arena, and finally the mines, exposes an empire that built its grandeur upon the broken and voiceless. Each method of torment was more than vengeance. It was a message carved into both flesh and history: defy the order, and you will be made to vanish from it. These acts of calculated terror didn't just enforce obedience, they defined power itself. They remind us that throughout human history, domination has often depended on two things: the public display of pain and the hidden silence of those who endured it. And as we look back through the centuries, we're left with a haunting question. Which of these Roman punishments, in your eyes, most exposes the limits of human cruelty and the enduring strength of those who refuse to be broken? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice adds life to the lessons history tried to bury. If you found this glimpse into the darker truths of Rome compelling, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. Every day, we uncover stories that reveal not just how power was used, but what it truly cost. Because the past isn't just history. It's a mirror reflecting who we still are today.